Professor Shearmur.
Good afternoon.
This is Hamid Morshed,
Hi.
Hamid Tehrani.
Hi.
Compassionate. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, welcome to our online webinar today, entitled Marmaduke Pickthall, the first British Muslim translator of the Quran. Our presenter today is Professor Jeremy Shearmur, who has worked in universities in Britain, the United States, and Australia. He has taught philosophy and political theory in those universities. At the moment, he is an emeritus fellow of the Australian National University and is currently living in Dumfries in Scotland. He is the author of the political thought of Karl Popper and Hayek and After. He was joint editor of Karl Popper's After the Open Society, and his edition of Friedrich Hayek's Law, Legislation, Liberty will appear later this year. He has had for several years an interest in Marmaduke Pickthall and in early British converts to Islam. He has published the Working Mosque Muslims, British Islam in the early 20th century. This is the title of the article, which appeared in the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs, number 34, number 2, 2014. Without further ado, Professor Shearmur, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all the participants for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for the invitation, which I appreciate very much. I must start with an apology. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today about Pickthall, who seems to me a fascinating character, but I should at once issue a kind of apology. I'm interested in Pickthall, but I don't claim to be an expert on his life and work. In addition, I'm not a Muslim, and I also have no knowledge of Arabic or Urdu. As a result, while I've had my material looked over by friends who know more than I do, there may well be mispronunciations and also mistakes which will be obvious to those with the background that I lack. If this is the case, I apologize and would welcome corrections in the discussion period or by email. If just after the First World War, you'd taken a train from London towards Portsmouth, you might have been surprised to see out of the left-hand window, just before you reached Woking Station, a small mosque. Had you got out at Woking to investigate, you might have been even more surprised to find a group of largely English middle and upper class converts to Islam, whose services were led by an Indian barrister and his compatriots. And this is a picture of this small mosque in Woking. You would also have found, if you talked with these people, that they were practicing what might be termed a distinctively British form of Islam. It involved two things. On the one side, they'd adopted a modernist form of Islam in which a lot of things were reworked to fit ideas which were common enough at the end of the 19th century and at the time in which they were operating in the early part of the 20th century. There was a stress on the unity of God, but there'd also been a minimization of much that was culturally distinctive about Islam. On the other side, what they did while practicing Islam was often distinctively British in its character. But who were these people? For the most part, they were middle class or in some cases aristocratic British people. They included an Anglo-Irish peer, Lord Headley. A number of them seem to have been drawn to Islam as a result of serving as officers in the British Empire and being impressed by individual Muslims whom they had met. They gathered in a prayer room in London and at the mosque in Woking for festivals and sometimes on Fridays, and also they had meetings there on Sundays. Lord Headley, whom I referred to as an interesting character, professionally, he was a civil engineer, having worked in British India in that capacity. He was a keep fit enthusiast and the author of books on boxing and on the use of the broadsword. He seems to have come to monotheistic religious views of his own, which he was subsequently to identify with a very liberal understanding of Islam. He regularly argued in books and papers that Islam should, in Britain, be reinterpreted to make it better fit the customs and habits of the British, including their habit of breakfasting on bacon and eggs and their drinking beer, albeit in moderation. Just because he was a peer, because he was Lord Headley, on his conversion, he was accorded an important role as a spokesman for British Islam. It was very much a class segmented society. He was sincere and went on the Hajj. He played an important role as a spokesman and in raising funds for a mosque in central London. He also stressed continuities between Islam and other Abrahamic faiths, but his own understanding of Islam really was rather limited, and he tended to downplay the idea that there was any dissension within Islam, contrasting this with sectarianism in Christianity, where he had spent a lot of time in Ireland, where the divisions there between Protestants and Catholics were really very, very strong. All told, Headley is a striking, but in some ways a rather sad figure. If you'd like to find out more, I'd strongly recommend the recent biography of him by Jamie Gillam called The British Muslim Convert, Lord Headley. The group also met for meals in hotels in London. There they were also sometimes joined by a Lady Evelyn Cobbold. She had an audience with the Pope, head of the Catholic Church, but he shocked him because when he asked her, "Are you a Catholic?" she said, "No, I'm a Muslim," which she also, like Headley, undertook Hajj, albeit in her case under somewhat luxurious conditions. Her book about this pilgrimage to Mecca is well worth reading. And here is a picture of Lord Headley, the chap with the white hair and the moustache, together with the Indian lawyer, Khwaja Kamal-ud-Din, and on the other side, Lady Evelyn Cobbold. It would be useful also to say something briefly about the mosque and about the Indian barrister, Khwaja Kamal-ud-Din. The mosque had been constructed with money that he had obtained from a Nawab Begum, ruler of the princely state of Bhopal, by Dr. Gottfried Leitner. He was Jewish by birth. He was an incredibly talented linguist. He'd served for a while as professor of Arabic at King's College, London, but he subsequently became principal of the Government College University in Lahore. After his return to Britain, he wished to start an institute for the study of Oriental languages and was able to purchase premises in Woking for this purpose. The mosque, which he got money to have designed there, was planned for the use of the students at this institute. And there were also supposed to be other places of worship there as well, but they weren't constructed. Leitner died in 1899. Some of the buildings which he'd used for his institute were demolished and the mosque fell into disuse. The mosque itself was apparently also to be demolished, but plans for this were, it seems, successfully contested in the British courts by Kamal-ud-Din. He was an Indian Muslim lawyer who came to Britain to contest a legal case. However, he wasn't just any Indian lawyer, but in fact a leading figure among the Ahmadiyya. This raises issues that I cannot sensibly explore in a corner of a talk about Pickthall, but I need to say something brief about this in relation to the Woking Mosque and the British converts associated with it. A good friend of mine has advised me against discussing this topic here at all, but it seems to me important to do so just because you could well ask, if the Woking Mosque and the mission associated with it had an Ahmadiyya connection, was Pickthall, who had an involvement with the mosque, an Ahmadi or influenced by them? The short answer to this is no, he wasn't, but the explanation for this is worth setting out briefly just because this connection is known about amongst people who have an interest in early British converts to Islam. Briefly, Kamal-ud-Din had been impressed by Mirza Ahmad, and it would seem that his own faith in Islam had been reinvigorated by his contacts with this guy. Kamal-ud-Din became an effective speaker and debater on the Indian subcontinent for Islam, but he was criticized amongst the Ahmadiyya for his lack of emphasis on Ahmad's distinctive claims. He stressed rather commonalities with Sunni Islam as a whole, while taking a very liberal or modernist view of Islam. When the Ahmadiyya split, he became a leading figure on the so-called Lahore side. He disavowed any idea that Ahmad should be understood as having or claiming properly a prophetic status, and also repudiated the idea that those Muslims who didn't accept Ahmad's message weren't really Muslim. What exactly his views were would be a difficult matter to work out, not least because issues about how one should take the meaning that was given to claims that Ahmad made about himself by people among the Lahore Ahmadiyya and where exactly Kamal-ud-Din stood are complex. But luckily, we don't need to concern ourselves with this at all. For when Kamal-ud-Din came to Britain and dedicated himself to the propagation of Islam, he undertook not to discuss any of Ahmad's distinctive and controversial claims. What this meant was that what was spread by Kamal-ud-Din was a generic but extremely liberal Sunni Islam. Headley and Pickthall both explicitly identified themselves as Sunni Muslims who followed the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, while the Woking Mosque accepted anyone as a Muslim who declared the Shahada. Indeed, the only disagreement that seems to have taken place was between them and the Qadiani Ahmadiyya community in London, in part over the Qadianic exclusive claims, but also because their social ideas seemed to the Woking people to be somewhat illiberal. A final point concerning Kamal-ud-Din. His liberalism and willingness to accommodate the British had, I suspect, several different elements. In part, his own ideas were clearly liberal and modernist in their character, not unlike those of other liberal and modernist Muslims in India. In part, though, his approach seems to have been to lead British converts only gradually towards the culturally unfamiliar requirements of Islam, which were anyway quite difficult for people in their situation to move straight into. In part also, I think one has to bear in mind the period that we're dealing with, and also whom he was dealing with. That to say, people from a middle class and aristocratic background against the backdrop of the British Empire, where everybody in Britain and in the empire was sort of expected to defer to these people. And what about the mosque? Well, it was acquired cheaply from Leitner's family by a group setting out to raise money to build a mosque in London, and then it was given over for the use of Kamal-ud-Din's missionary efforts. What about Pickthall? When Kamal-ud-Din left England in 1919, services at the prayer room and the mosque, which involved saying prayers in Arabic and English, were led by Marmaduke Pickthall. But who was he, and how did he end up at the Woking Mosque? He was a son of an Anglican clergyman in the Church of England. He had been a day scholar at Harrow while Winston Churchill was at school there as a boarder. Pickthall had hoped to go into a branch of the British Foreign Service, but had to drop out because when he was quite young, a fever had somehow wiped out his ability to do mathematics, which he would have needed for the entrance exam for the Foreign Service. He was still interested in the Foreign Service, and it was decided between him and his family that he still might be able to get in if he was able to acquire a good grasp of relevant languages. He quickly acquired French and Italian, and it was then decided that he would go to the Middle East to acquire Arabic. When he arrived, rather than just staying with a respectable British family and taking lessons in Arabic, he instead used funds from his family to team up with a local translator and tourist guide who, on the off-season from that work, traveled with Pickthall round parts of Palestine and Syria, living just as would the local people. And here is a picture, one of the very few, of Pickthall. As a result of this, Pickthall got a really good knowledge of local people in that area and their customs, and at the same time acquired a fluent knowledge of colloquial Syrian Arabic. And he used his knowledge of this as material as the background for a couple of novels. One book of his called Oriental Encounters, which I'd strongly recommend, is in effect a fictionalized account of these travels of his as a young man. There was another book, Said the Fisherman, which is a long rambling tale about the misadventures of a thief. Pickthall was impressed by his 2-year stay in the Middle East. He came clearly to identify strongly with the local people, and he took a very critical view of the conduct of many of the Europeans in the areas that he visited. And he was, I should also add, and this becomes important later, really very critical of the way in which some of the Christians within the Ottoman Empire were in effect exploiting the support of European powers to kind of push themselves forward and to take advantages of the local Muslim people. He was also impressed by his experience of Islam and made some tentative inquiries about what would be involved in converting. But he was actually dissuaded from this by a religious leader of the great mosque in Damascus. Pickthall was told, wait until you're older and have seen again your native land. You are among us, so are our boys alone among the Christians. God knows how I should feel if any Christian teacher dealt with a son of mine otherwise than as I now deal with you. Pickthall, at the age of 20, after 2 years abroad, returned to Britain and to the practice of Anglican Christianity. He got married and then supported himself and his wife somewhat tenuously by work as a journalist and a novelist. In 1907, he was invited to Egypt by a British official, and he and his wife then spent some time in Beirut and Palestine before returning to Britain. He wrote more novels and also book reviews and journalism. And in the journalism over time, he showed increasing sympathy for the Ottoman Empire, and particularly for the Muslim reformists in the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, he emphatically didn't share the growing sympathy that there was in England for Russia as an ally, rather than its traditional alliance with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. Indeed, opposing this, he strongly favored the older conservative approach, which he found in Disraeli, of looking to the Ottoman Empire as an ally against Russia. And in addition, ever since he'd been in Syria, he disliked the way in which some local Christians behaved in relation to the Ottomans, because they had behind them the support of the European powers. And he found that this was increasing with the growth of Christian nationalism in the Balkans, which he really didn't like. In Britain, he reacted against the uncritical support and what seemed to him to be the unfair reporting of Christian rebels against the Ottomans in the Balkans. He was critical of the sort of nationalism that was being appealed to, and of the way in which anti-Muslim prejudices were being stirred up against the Ottoman Empire in the British newspapers. In 1913, he went to Istanbul on the strength of an advance from a publisher of the royalties of a book. While he was there, he learned Turkish. He was very adept at learning languages. But it's worth noting that it's been reported that while he was in Istanbul, he attended a Christian church. He also had the chance to get to know a number of educated and liberal-minded Muslims. He had had introductions to them from a diplomat whom he got to know well. Pickthall was impressed by the political reformers, essentially the Young Turks, and also by the liberal and rationalistic interpretations of Islam, which he came across there. On his return to England, he published articles and then a book based on his stay in Turkey with the title With the Turk in Wartime. And the wartime here is with the war in the Balkans against the Bulgarians. And as the First World War developed, he continued writing in support of the Ottoman Empire and the hopes of modernization based on liberal constitutional reform there being undertaken by Muslims whom he'd met. Pickthall argued strongly against Britain being at war with the Ottoman Empire, and he favored and would like to have helped negotiate a separate peace between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, but he was refused permission to engage in this. Influenced, I suspect, by what he'd earlier felt to be the unfairness of the reporting of the earlier wars in the Balkans, he tried to defend the Ottoman Empire against charges of massacre of the Armenians, arguing that while terrible things had taken place, the situation was much more complex than a simple account of massacre would suggest. Pickthall's initial sympathies with the Ottoman Empire seem to have been political. And as a couple of writers have suggested, one might see this and his good relations with politically and religiously liberal Muslims in Istanbul as contrasted with increasingly bellicose anti-Ottoman and anti-Islamic sentiments in Britain, as having been what shifted him towards Islam in terms of his religious views. He seems to have been particularly provoked by the singing of an anti-Islamic hymn in a church service that he attended in 1914. And a biographer has said, in the face of this, he slipped quietly from the church and from Christianity. By 1917, as his biographer Peter Clark notes, there were increasingly favorable references to Muhammad in his writings. And in a talk to the Muslim Literary Society in November 2017, he declared himself to be a Muslim. He made connections with other British converts, some of whom he already knew from Ottoman-related activities, and he participated in the Woking Mosque and associated activities in London. It would seem clear, for example, from what he says in With the Turk at Wartime, that he'd been acquiring a knowledge of classical Arabic and that he had some familiarity with the Qur'an. Accordingly, while he converted to Islam later than did Lord Headley, he had a fair bit of knowledge about Islam prior to his conversion. While Kamal-ud-Din was away sometimes for lengthy periods, Pickthall stood in for him at religious services and acted as imam when Kamal-ud-Din left for India until his replacement arrived. I should say about this, it wasn't a matter of his illegitimately pushing himself ahead of other people. It was in a situation where there were a small number of British converts without anyone with the ability to service them and to take their services at all. Pickthall also started to write extensively on themes to do with Islam. He defended the very liberal interpretation of Islam, which he'd become acquainted with in Istanbul. It isn't clear to what extent his views were in line with Kamal-ud-Din's views. On the death of Kamal-ud-Din, he indicated in a brief obituary note that there had been some disagreements between them, without going into details. Pickthall's problem, however, was a practical one. How was he to make a living? His open espousal of the Ottoman cause meant that he wasn't eligible for government positions for which otherwise, with his linguistic abilities and geographical knowledge, he would have been an obvious candidate. Rather than being employed by the British government, government officials were keeping an eye on him and his activities, lest he could be deemed to be actually hostile to them. He raised, however, no problem when he was recruited into the British Armed Forces. Pickthall's journalism and novels hardly kept the wolf from the door. His needs seem to have been very modest, but it just wasn't clear that he could continue to meet them. He was offered an accepted position, first with the pro-Ottoman group and then with the Islamic Information Bureau in London. This was financed by some wealthy Indian Muslims. They had as a particular interest opposition to a British attempt to promote the Sharif of Mecca as an alternative to the religious leadership offered to Sunni Muslims by the Ottoman Emperor in his role as Caliph. This was strongly resisted, this British move, by leading Muslims in India, and Pickthall was sympathetic to their campaign, the so-called Khilafat movement. The Khilafat movement, however, in India also attracted the support of Gandhi and became allied to the cause of Indian self-rule. There is, it seems to me, an interesting issue here relating to the development of Pickthall's political views. He'd been attracted initially to the cause of the Ottoman Empire, in part by older conservative ideas about British interests and the need to avoid a Russian threat to British India. he then seems to have become attracted to the idea that an Ottoman Empire reformed on the basis of the constitutional ideas of the Young Turks might itself offer a model of really good political guidance for the Middle East. But one finds Pickthall gradually himself lining up with the cause of Indian self-rule. This and his views when he was in India would merit detailed study, but it would require access to materials which are not available to me in Scotland, and I think also to follow this issue properly, one would need a knowledge of Urdu, which I think not only don't I have, but I'm probably too old to acquire. Pickthall's relations with some of the other people involved in the Bureau were not easy, and Pickthall was delighted when he received out of the blue an offer for him to come to India to become editor of the Bombay Chronicle. This was a progressive newspaper which identified with the cause of Indian self-rule. Pickthall had to work very hard as he was also writing editorials and faced problems in terms of the supervision of the staff of the newspaper, which he hadn't been involved in before. However, he threw himself into this and also into the Khilafat movement and did a lot of public speaking and got to know Gandhi quite well. Indian nationalist politics was, however, a minefield, and the previous British editor of the Bombay Chronicle had been deported back to England because what they were doing had been deemed politically unacceptable. Pickthall appeared at meetings alongside Gandhi and also with Muslim leaders in making a case for Indian self-rule. However, not all Muslim leaders favored an alliance with Gandhi. And an obvious issue, which hardly needs pointing out to yourselves, was what the position of Muslims would be within a Hindu majority India. And different Muslim scholars can be found taking very different views about what the attitudes of Muslims should be towards all these developments. Further, the board of the newspaper were not as enthusiastic as was Pickthall about the alliance with Gandhi. While Pickthall's position on the newspaper and his support for Indian self-rule alienated him from British people in India, which his wife didn't like, and she returned to Britain for a couple of years. Things were brought to a head by two issues. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who had brought Turkey out of the ruins of the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, abolished the Ottoman Caliphate. While in India, the Bombay Chronicle was sold and its new owners insisted that the paper attack Gandhi, which Pickthall wasn't willing to do. The Chronicle also seems to have lost an expensive court case initiated against them by the government. Pickthall was out of a job, but he was able to secure employment with the Nizam of Hyderabad. And here is a picture of His Highness. At this time, Hyderabad was an independent Indian state within the Raj, ruled by a Muslim prince who was reputedly the richest man in the world, but also had a reputation of being very careful with his money. However, he spent money on modernization of the state and was happy to offer Pickthall employment as the head of a school and also having a task of educating Indians for positions in the Nizam's public service. Pickthall accepted the job. He also became editor of an English language academic journal called Islamic Culture. If this was not enough, Pickthall continued work on a long-term project of his, the translation of the Qur'an into English. This is something on which he'd been working for many years. Indeed, The distinguished Catholic writer Anne Fremantle has recounted that Pickthall and his wife at one point rented a cottage in the grounds of her family's house in England. And this is a picture of Anne Fremantle, who became a distinguished Catholic woman of letters. Pickthall had shown her some of his translations of verses from the Qur'an into English, and she was really impressed by their beauty, and at the very young age of 10, converted to Islam, went to the working mosque, and was praying regularly 5 times a day. Her family seems to have brought her up with no religious views at all. Her mother seemed happy enough about her conversion, and also that of her younger sister. Her father wasn't so keen, but there were no obstacles. Her family, however, was very wealthy, and they spent time in Britain and also in France, in Aix-les-Bains. And she later recounted that when she was over there, she'd mentioned to a Catholic priest that she was a Muslim. And to quote her, he was horrified. He taught me Latin from Cicero and St. Augustine, and at the end of a year, I wished to become a Catholic. In the event, Anne eventually moved to the United States, and when she was over there, she indeed converted to Catholicism and became a significant Catholic writer, a woman of letters. Clearly, a loss to Islam. However, she stayed in touch with Pickthall, corresponded with him when he was in India, and on his death, at the invitation of his wife, wrote a biography of him called Loyal Enemy. This suggesting really that he was loyal to Britain, but at the same time espousing ideas that were in opposition to those which the British government favored. But what of Pickthall's translation of the Quran? The Nizam eventually gave him some time off from his job at the college to work on this, and he brought the task to completion. There were, however, some problems. Pickthall wished to get approval of his work from senior Muslim scholars, and the first problem that he hit was that some people claimed that there were difficulties about the very idea that there could be a translation of the Quran. Pickthall understood the objections, but he overcame this difficulty by calling his work in English not the Quran, but rather the meaning of the glorious Quran, which was considered some people then to be perfectly acceptable. He also resisted the idea, to which he wasn't opposed in principle, that in his translation, the Arabic should be printed alongside the English text. But he thought that this wasn't a very practical idea, just because if you're dealing with English people who have no Arabic at all, this would just put people off. It wouldn't really assist them, and finding a book which was bilingual in this way would just be likely to make people resistant to reading it. He then thought of polishing up an endorsement of his translation by religious scholars associated with the authoritative Al-Azhar Mosque and University in Cairo. Here he hit a problem. While he found that some scholars were happy to help, the king of Egypt at the time was one of those who was opposed to the very idea of a translation being undertaken. Pickthall was also told that he'd only get the approval of some scholars if Pickthall's English manuscript was retranslated into Arabic and then compared to the actual text of the Quran, just to make sure that things weren't going wrong. Pickthall worked with scholars in Egypt. The text was improved and the retranslation was done, although even after that, some people still raised some objections. However, it was clearly an impressive and has been a well-regarded piece of work, the first translation, as I understand it, being produced by a native speaker of English who was also a Muslim. Pickthall's translation the English style of which is rather old-fashioned. I mean, it reads in some ways like the so-called King James Bible. It's a little like reading something that's almost in Shakespearean English. It is still widely used. You can find it in many parts of the internet. In addition, I understand that a version in which the English has been updated and modernized has now been published. It has the reputation of being the most literal of the English translations. Pickthall, after this, returned to work for the Nizam, where his tasks included assisting with international negotiations concerning the dynastic marriage between the Nizam's son and the Caliph's daughter. The whole saga, however, and his additional work there seems to have been exhausting. Pickthall retired in 1935 and returned to England, but once he'd got there, swiftly died of a heart attack in 1936. Pickthall is buried in the Old Muslim section of Brookwood Cemetery. It's a cemetery in a place not all that far from Woking. It's a massive but interesting graveyard, which used to have its own train service going out from London and stopping there. It has various sections dedicated to the burial of members of different religious groups. The Old Muslim section is close to that, for example, of the Parsis. Pickthall lies there alongside the graves of several of the people who were his companions at the Woking Mosque. And here is a picture of his grave. The mosque itself continues in operation. While Pickthall was there, it was particularly tolerant in its approach, but the influence of the Lahore Ahmadiyya became stronger over time, and there was in due course a revolt against this by some of the local Muslims who've moved to the Woking area from Pakistan. The Lahore Ahmadiyya had to leave and are now meeting somewhere in the Wembley area, but they maintain a website dedicated to the early years of the Woking Mosque, which includes back copies of a magazine produced right through this period, which gives a lot of information about the early days of the mosque and the ideas of the people who were meeting there. This might seem the end of the story, but there has in recent years been some interest shown in Pickthall and in William Henry Quilliam, who converted to Islam, opened a mosque in Liverpool, but spent the latter part of his life associated with the Woking Mosque, but living under an alias rather than living as Quilliam. Why were people interested? Well, just because they became interested in what Islam might look like in a British cultural setting. One might, for example, compare the brief discussion in Sadek Hamid's book, Sufis, Salafis, and Islamists, and also Yahya's piece in Gillam and Greaves' collection, Victorian Muslim, both of which discuss this kind of interest. It's significant just because Islam in Britain has been seen very much in terms of the specific cultural settings, especially those that people have brought from Pakistan or India and Bangladesh, but also from a number of other countries which relatively recent migrants have brought with them to Britain. However, members of, as it were, the third generation offspring of migrants sometimes now identify as Muslim and British rather than with the specific national background and culture of their grandparents. But this then poses the question, what does it mean to be Muslim and British? And it is this which has led some people to have a look back to see whether Pickthall and Quilliam might have anything of interest to contribute on this particular score. Pickthall and the other early Muslim converts are interesting figures. They were certainly very British, but they don't, I think, offer in themselves a very useful model for today, in part just because the Britain of which they were a part has now itself disappeared. I mean, we're just now not living in a culture which is anything like the culture they were living in. The structure of Britain is completely different, and we are now multicultural in a way in which Britain of their time simply wasn't. In addition, the kind of modernist interpretation of Islam that they favored has now gone very much out of fashion. It was interesting enough as offering an interpretation of Islam that fitted the times and the intellectual setting in which they were living. But I think it's not clear that what they were offering really made much sense intellectually. The endeavor to strip Islam of the supernatural and to reinterpret everything to fit what were liberal views in the early 20th century. I mean, people may be attracted to it now, but it seems to me that not only their modernism, but also other modernisms of the period are something that it's difficult to sustain in that kind of form now. Pickthall's own ideas developed after he left Britain. He became interested in the ideas of an Ottoman nobleman, Said Halim Pasha, whose work he translated from the French, and a number of these Ottomans were writing in French, and Pickthall himself translated this from French and published it in the journal Islamic Culture. And these ideas then influenced Pickthall's own later discussions of Islam. For example, his book, The Cultural Side of Islam, which was given as lectures, published then in episodes in Islamic Culture, and was then published as a book in India, and it is still in print in English in the Indian subcontinent. This was an interesting attempt to combine liberal and Islamist themes and shows a maturity in his knowledge which goes way beyond his own early writings when he was in Britain. I think it would merit further study by specialists, but I think it's very much something which needs to be studied by people who are themselves specialists in the development of the interpretation of Islam through this period. As far as I know, the book made no impression in England, but there is a most interesting discussion in M.A. Sherif's article, Pickthall's Islamic Politics, the fullest version of which is available on the internet. All told, Pickthall seems to me a most interesting figure. Scholars are currently working on untangling just what was going on in his interactions with people in London, in Turkey, and in India. His novels are readily available, many of them in versions cheaply reprinted from PDF files, but the PDFs themselves are available for free online. If you're interested, if you do, say, a Google search on Marmaduke Pickthall Internet Archive, you will get a link to the full range of his novels. If you're interested, aren't familiar with his work, I'd strongly recommend starting with his Oriental Encounters, while The Early Hours gives an interesting picture of his view of the Young Turk in the Ottoman Empire and some impressions of his understanding of Islam prior to his conversion. If you'd like to do some further reading, Peter Clark's Marmaduke Pickthall, British Muslim is interesting, as is Jamie Gillam's Loyal Enemies, Sherif's Braveheart, and Fremantle's much older Loyal Enemy is good because she had access to his papers. The collection by Nash, Marmaduke Pickthall, Islam and the Modern World, really is giving a pretty good account of modern scholarship on Pickthall and his work, while Jamie Gillam's The British Muslim Convert, Lord Headley, are really excellent starting points. A final note. And Fremantle was given Pickthall's papers by his wife. Fremantle gave the manuscript of his translation of the Qur'an to Princeton, and it's held in the Princeton University's archives. She has written that she sent Pickthall's papers to Hyderabad. These would have included letters and also the manuscript of an unpublished novel of his set in the Mughal Empire. All of this, I think, would be fascinating for scholars, but it's not clear where the papers ended up, and indeed if they still exist or what condition they might be in if they do. If anyone gets to Hyderabad or knows scholars based there, it would, I think, really be excellent and a service to everyone with an interest in Pickthall and in this slightly odd corner of the history of Islam in relation to Britain, if these things could be investigated. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shearmur, for your excellent presentation and for introducing the life and achievements of Marmaduke Pickthall. We are now opening the floor to questions from the participants. One question per participant, please. Make it to the point and raise your hand first.
Could I stress not just questions, but also corrections and objections?
Yes, yes. If there are objections, comments, but please make your comment to the point and succinct. Thank you very much. Any comments? Okay, before Anas, please introduce yourself. And
yes, hello, thank you very much for the presentation. The question that I wanted to ask was really about Pickthall's motivation for translating the Quran, because, you know, from the picture that was presented, you know, he didn't seem primarily interested in the spiritual side of Islam. It was very much, you know, he got to the religion through politics and through personal interactions with people in the countries that he traveled. So given that, it's not necessarily obvious why he would think, you know, to dedicate several years of his life to a translation of the Quran. So can you speak to that a bit, please?
Thanks very much. I think really that there are different elements to the story. As far as I can see, and this is the impression that I've got from reading his journalism from the period and also his novels set in the Ottoman Empire, a significant motive seems to have been pushing him in the direction of conversion, something that was connected up to issues in politics. But it should be said, he seems to have been someone who was previously a pious Christian, and he seems really to have been studying the Quran, to have been really very, very impressed with its beauty, and he has very strong spiritual concerns. So I think one might really say the following. His early experience of the travels, he found that he was in a traditional Muslim society, which he found attractive, but very different from modern societies. I think then what impressed him a lot when he went to Istanbul was to find people who were educated, who were concerned with developing an understanding of Islam that seemed to speak to modern conditions, and which also was reflecting on the problems of contemporary society in a way in which the people that he'd come across previously weren't. I mean, they were in some ways, I mean, it would be wrong and patronizing to say that they were in historical backwaters, but they weren't influenced by the problems of modernity in the sort of way in which these other people were. But he seems then really to have become captivated by the Quran and its beauty. And he seems really to have then taken the study of and the understanding of Islam very seriously. And the impression that I have is really that his early writings about Islam, when he was in Britain, were I mean, they are well done, and he makes good points, but they are in some respects quite superficial. You get him once he's in India and once he's grappling with the scholarship that he finds there, really coming to terms seriously with the intellectual and spiritual challenges of Islam itself. So I think it's a gradual business. I think also that Pickthall was clearly someone who in other circumstances would have been both a dedicated and sincere man, but also a real scholar. But the exigencies of his circumstances meant really that he was having to work incredibly hard in pursuing these things while desperately trying to make a living. Does that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anas, for your question. We also have a question from Mr. Jamil Sharif. He says, what would have influenced Marmaduke Pickthall's warnings about Zionism in Palestine in June 1917 before Balfour Declaration? Did he have friends that would have pushed him in that direction, or his dislike of Christian Zionists that he may have met in 1913?
My knowledge of this is limited, but what is clear if one looks at his Oriental encounters, which is his account of the time that he was spending as a young man in Palestine and Syria, was that he was there at one point interested in acquiring a somewhere to live. And he discovered simply what the complexity and deep attachments were in the area of people to the land and to the very the kind of complications of rites and traditions connected with it. And it's in this context that he sort of got wind of the fact that people were wanting to propose this as somewhere where which should be used for the mass settling of Jewish people, and he just thought this, given his knowledge of the country, the population, and their attachment to the complexities of life, there was just madness. So the problem on the other side of it was that he became increasingly partisan for the Ottoman Empire and for the views of the Young Turks. And in this context, he was really very much at odds with people who were advocating the Balfour Declaration and these sorts of things. Pickthall himself, he was writing, but he was writing in what were otherwise quite radical magazines, and he just wasn't in a position to influence anybody. I mean, he could certainly make his opinions known, but some of the people who've written about him were able to look at, I mean, essentially police and other reports on him and his activities where people took a very dim view of what he was doing. So you have this slightly odd social situation, but he was clearly someone who was a member in some ways of the upper middle classes. On the other, he didn't have any money. And a third element of it was that he espoused views, and it's worth noting, he espoused views and advocated them through the wartime period, where he was really arguing quite strongly that Britain should be making a peace with the Ottoman Empire, and then was resisting very strongly Britain's attempt to maneuver Muslim religious leadership to its own advantage. So he was an important critical voice, but he wasn't going to be someone who anyone was very likely to listen to just because he was so strongly opposed to the general tack that the government had been taking. I mean, you don't have to think for very far to think of almost contemporary models of this, where you get a particular idée fixe taking over people, and other people can speak out against it, but what they're saying just seems to make no impression. Does that address your point adequately, or were you after me?
I think you have covered it perfectly. We're going to the next question. Is there a connection between Islamophobia? This is from Bülent Sönmez. He has asked, is there a question between Islamophobia and the fact that immigrants are only Muslims when the number of European or Western Muslims decreases? Did Muslims of European descent decrease in Europe after Pickthall's time?
I think there are different elements to this. There was a particular group of people around the time of and immediately after the First World War, to whom the kind of message that was being offered in the Woking Mosque seems to have appealed quite strongly. The difficulty really was that you were dealing there with a society in which class meant a very great deal, and where it is just not clear that there were figures after Headley who were in a position to be effective spokesmen for those kinds of views. As I've said, it seems to me that really you get at the Woking Mosque itself a shift from the mainstream Islam towards something which is much more influenced by the Lahore Ahmadiyyas, and where it's just not very clear. I mean, I may be simply ignorant about this, but if you consider the period in the late 1920s, 30s, and 40s, are there figures in Britain who are educated Muslims who are in a position to speak for Islam? Another point to be made is really this. I mean, I don't want to be unpleasant or patronizing, but the converts to Islam didn't know anything much about Islam. Pickthall really was in many ways self-educated, and through his life, he picked up more and more knowledge. A lot of the other people knew no more about doctrinal matters, but also had no tradition of the practice of Islam behind them, so that really they would have faced difficulties making much of an impression on anyone. The problem then was, well, I have to say two things. There was obviously, and quite separate from the people that I've been talking about, Muslims living particularly in port cities, who in many cases had married, they come over as single working men, had married English or Scots women, but you didn't have there anything really which could make much impact on the culture more widely. The situation then was that the mass migration of Muslims to Britain typically came from people who were coming very often from farming backgrounds, were making a living in factories or running restaurants. They were able to bring scholars over who could service their own community, but who typically weren't in a position to make much impact on British culture as such. And I don't mean in this respect that people in Britain would only listen to other people who were British, but I think in many ways it would have been a matter of finding ways to address the shared background cultural concerns of other British people at the time, which these people were in no position to do. So I think that that's really the story. I'm sure that things will change over time, and that particularly once one has people who have both a strong Islamic education, but also a strong Western education as well, they'll be in a position to make a powerful case for Islam. And in fact, I can draw a parallel here, because one thing which was really very striking is this. In Britain, Catholicism almost died out. There was a kind of top-down imposition of Protestantism, and there were just a relatively few, in some cases, aristocratic families who were Catholic, but they had to do things very quietly and keep themselves very much to themselves. There were then good numbers of people who came from Ireland who were Catholic and who settled in different British towns. But it was really only once you got people who were already educated British people who converted to Catholicism that you then had, both amongst them and amongst native-born Catholics, really an intellectual revival of Catholicism that could address powerfully cultural issues at the time. And I would expect this to be the thing that the kind of thing that happens in the next generation. I mean, whether I will still be around to see it, I mean, I would be really very, very happy to, I don't know. But I suspect that there are lessons that could be learned from what happened with the so-called Catholic revival.
Thank you very much. Next question is, do you think that Pickthall would have been regarded as one of the great writers of the 20th century due to his works such as Said the Fisherman, were it not for his conversion to Islam and his assassination of enemy status?
I think he would have been judged an interesting minor writer. And what I have in mind is this. I mean, it's worth reading his novels. He's got some that are set in Britain. He's got one that's set, one or two that are set in Egypt, a couple with an Ottoman background, and so on. But they are interesting. I personally think that it's often his novels which have a semi-documentary aspect to them, which are actually much more interesting than the straight novels. And in this regard, you might say there's a kind of parallel between him and George Orwell, who also, I think, personally does much better when there is an autobiographical or a factual element behind his writing. So I don't think a great novelist. On the other hand, what we know very little about Pickthall's circumstances. I don't know what there would be amongst his papers if these were discovered. Fremantle made use of letters, but there is no Pickthall archive. There are a few things that people have found, for example, effectively these police reports and so on his pro-Ottoman activities. We don't really know much about his circumstances, but he produced quite a lot of novels really quite quickly. And one of the issues there may have been just his need to try to make a living, because his social status went well beyond his income. And that, I think, especially as he got married, must have placed him in a rather difficult position. So I wouldn't think that there would be, I mean, not sure that there would be any great prejudice against him as such. Part of it being that he was, to all intents and purposes, a modest, quietly spoken, upper middle class Englishman. Now, as things were in Britain, if you're in that situation, you could say that you are not going to elicit hostility of a kind that you might get if you had obviously come from a foreign background. So I'm not sure that his Islam as such would have created a problem. His espousal of the cause of the Ottoman Empire and his hostility towards aspects of British imperialism, I think would have made him not very popular in some circles, but then there were other people who took similar kinds of views. So, I mean, it's a difficult matter. I think all along, the problem is likely to be more of how do you actually earn a living given you are who he is. And what's very striking again is that in Hyderabad, I mean, he was made the principal of a school, he was giving instruction to civil servants, he was the editor of an academic journal, and also at one point he was made a kind of director of publicity for Hyderabad as well. And I think he was in a situation where, you know, basically if he was asked to do something, he did it. But this clearly meant that it's astounding that he was able to do the sort of work that he was doing. You'd need to be a lot more leisured, I think, really to be very effective as a man of letters, as it were.
Thank you. There was a question from Mr. Sharif, which I have decided not to discuss it, but now that Mr. Hossein has sent a link, I will go back to that. He had asked, Mr. Jamil Sharif had asked, do you know anyone who has seen the deposit at Princeton University? Could it include a commentary / tafsir, which never got included? Mr. Hossein, who is himself, who is living in the States himself and who is a scholar, and I know him quite well, he has sent a link on WorldCat, which shows the manuscript for Pickthall. So anyone who clicks on that link, they can see in the chat section, they can see the manuscript there. Is there anything else that you can tell us, Professor Shearmur?
No, I'm sorry, I can't really add anything. I simply read in some of Anne Fremantle's work that she'd given that manuscript of the Quran to Princeton. I then checked, and it is held in the Princeton archive, but I haven't had the opportunity. I mean, this is stuff that I discovered only quite recently, and there's no prospect of my going over there at the moment. And in addition, I mean, I am not a scholar of the Quran, and so I don't think personally I'm likely to get anything much from looking at the manuscript. I mean, clearly, there are people who've done specialist work comparing different versions of the Quran, and there have been questions about, you know, how one handles different interpretations and whether people's more general philosophical and religious views have influenced them. And those people might find that material fascinating, but I fear that it just is stuff for which I'm not qualified to participate.
Could you clarify whether this is just a manuscript or is a manuscript plus letters or other things?
As far as I know, it is just the manuscript, but I don't know anything more about it than that there is a catalog entry in the archive at the Princeton University Library. So if someone is interested in that, they can find out certainly, probably more than I know about it by looking at that source. I suspect Princeton, being the kind of institution that it is, that you might be able to write to the library there, just asking if they can give that kind of information. But you would know.
For your information, Professor Shearmur, the information is available. It's on WorldCat website.
Yes, yes.
The manuscript, all the details of the manuscripts are available. So the manuscript is there. The manuscript is there, and there is no doubt or ambiguity about that.
No, all I'm saying is that my knowledge on this doesn't go beyond what I'd said. And second, that because of my own ignorance in this area, I'm not sure that my examining it would be likely to help me in answering questions that might be put about it. It's my fault, as it were, that I am not a scholar in this area.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. The next question is from Anna Lebachar. She has Asma Lebachar. She has asked, what kind of relationship did Pickthall have with Sayyid Halim Pasha?
Well,
I would like to add one question myself. What was his position on the Young Turks? Was he pro-Young Turks or was he against them? Considering his loyalty to the Ottoman Caliph, it seems like he was not, he would not be a close friend of the Young Turks.
Well, I can answer this in, as it were, three parts. Pickthall met and was formally introduced to this gentleman. He had what seems to have been a rather formal and slightly stilted interview with him, and he didn't at that point know anything about his intellectual interests. It was only later that he came across this guy's writings and was then impressed by them, translated the Islamism piece, which was published in Islamic Culture, and then was clearly influenced by it in his own lectures. As to the situation in relation to the Ottoman Empire, Pickthall's position, on my understanding, was really this. He was initially not sure about the Young Turks. He then, when he got to Turkey, had a chance to talk with them and with the liberal opponents, and to come across some of the people who were trying to restore the Ottoman emperor. And basically, Pickthall seems to have become an enthusiast for the Young Turks. At the same time, he separated this from his later espousal of the caliphate as distinct from the political rule. And it's worth noting that that Ataturk didn't abolish the caliphate immediately after taking over in Turkey. And it was only once he'd abolished the caliphate that the Khilafat movement itself kind of collapsed. But as I indicated, it looks as if there might have been a kind of hope, conceivably, for a restoration of the caliphate based on Hyderabad. And so I've seen it kind of speculated, at least, that this dynastic marriage, which didn't come to anything, might really have been undertaken in part because of the hopes of a revival of the caliphate, but based on Hyderabad. But this is simply speculation that I've seen. It isn't material that I know about. What is clear is that if you read the two novels of Pickthall's that are set in the Ottoman Empire, both the one which is basically a kind of semi-documentary, and the other one which is a novel, he really gives a kind of inside view of the hopes for reform on the part of the Young Turks. Now, what is actually going on? Well, some writers have looked at this and said, well, look, what is happening, particularly if one combines this with Pickthall's own and perhaps rather surprising earlier support for the British in Egypt, is that Pickthall seems to have become convinced that really the Ottoman Empire, reformed along the lines wished for by the Young Turks, could have produced a kind of, no, it would be wrong to say a surrogate for the British Empire, but rather an Islamic version of what those people who thought that aspects of the British influence was good were hoping for, but that might then be discharged by the a reformed Ottoman Empire. And so his view seems to have been, and I'm not advocating it, I'm just describing what some people who've written about it have said, that as distinct from people who were in Britain, who were enthusiasts for desert Arabs, you get Pickthall really saying what is needed seemed to him to be exactly what the Young Turks were favoring, namely a rationalistic, well-administered Islamic rule based on the Ottoman Empire. So it seems as if this was his view over that period. However, there are then complications. How exactly does this interrelate to the Khilafat movement and his involvement in that? And how does it then relate to what Pickthall was up to in India, supporting very strongly the case for self-rule in India? And all I would say there is that apart possibly from some comments that Sharif has made in the course of some of his most interesting writings, what one really needs on this is someone who goes and traces what Pickthall was up to, what the editorials were that he was writing for the Bombay Chronicle, what his correspondence with was with the Allies and with Gandhi and so on, and what the newspaper responses were to his involvement in the Indian self-rule movement. And then, if one interrelated that to his other writings, one might be able to answer your question. As this isn't something that I can undertake. Certainly I haven't done it. I wish I could, but I then wish possibly that I was, at least 30 years younger to go and undertake it. In the absence of that, I can't say anything more about it myself.
Thank you. This is the wish that all of us have.
Yes, but in my case, for genuine scholarly purposes.
Okay, before I ask the last question, I would like everyone to go to this link. It's the website of the Islamic College, which is the organization which is sponsoring and organizing this online webinar with Professor Shearmur. Please do go to this website and see what we have to offer and what we offer, both as an educational institution as well as a cultural force within London. We have an undergraduate program, postgraduate program, a powerful distance education program. We also have a powerful publishing house called ICAS Press. If you go to this website, you will be able to see all that we offer. The last question is from Aman Ali Khan, who has, okay, he says, it was said that Pickthall identified as a Hanafi. What were Pickthall's views on the different approaches to the interpretation of Islam, i.e. the various schools of thought within Islam?
Okay, what I would say is, I took it that when he identified as a Hanafi, what he was identifying with was the somewhat rationalistic approach that he found amongst the Muslims that he was talking to in Istanbul. I think what one would then have to do is to see whether in any of his later writings he had a better acquaintance with the different schools and with points of controversy between them. I think, I mean, it's important to bear in mind that at the point when Pickthall was influenced by these figures that he was talking to in Istanbul, he had an interest in things to do with Islam, but little knowledge. He was teaching himself. I mean, he got good colloquial Syrian Arabic. He was teaching himself classical Arabic, but he wasn't in a position to engage in heavy scholarship in this area. And while I'm sure that his interests widened, and one does find in connection with some of the material talking about his translation of the Quran, references being made to commentaries, I simply don't know what the extent was of his knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence, and where the other problem is that he was in a desperate situation to try to make a living. So while I actually don't doubt that he could have become, under other circumstances, a very able scholar, he was having to do all kinds of practical things just to make a living, rather than being able to dedicate himself to that. So that seems to have been what was behind his judgment, but it's not clear how informed his judgment was at the point when he made it. If there isn't anything else, could I just make a couple of concluding comments?
I don't think there is anything else unless anyone, because we have actually run out of time. It's 7:30. We're supposed to finish at this time.
Okay.
Go ahead.
What I wanted to say first of all is if I could give a plug to the Islamic College. I've taken a couple of short courses myself, and what I've got from them has been absolutely first rate. So I would give a personal endorsement to checking out the website. The other thing is this. I said at the beginning that I needed to apologize. I'm not a scholar in this area. If you have got objections which you are too polite to voice, if you've got questions, if you've got corrections, just send me an email and I'll be happy to correspond with you about it. And I would hope to be able to learn from you. And I am really honored that such an audience with such knowledge and distinction came to hear what I had to offer on this. Thank you very much, Hamid, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Some participants have personally asked me whether the PowerPoint presentation that you presented is available if they email it to you. Is that available? In case
yes, I would be, the simplest thing for me to do would be to turn it into a handout in Word, because that is much less compressed.
Sure.
But if anyone wants to email me, I spotted I've got a couple of corrections to make, and I'm happy to produce that and to send it out. But all I would say is, do take seriously my disclaimer at the beginning.
Yes.
And the other thing is that I don't want to be burnt in either reality or effigy for the various problems that I may well have got into. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Could you, just out of curiosity, which courses did you take at the college?
I took the one on Islam in Britain, and there was another one which was concerned really more with issues to do with the Quran and anthropology. There was a gentleman who was talking about his time in a Muslim setting in Africa, and so there was a lot of very interesting material on that.
Yes, yes. We do have a very powerful distance education program that offers accredited degree from Middlesex University. So we suggest and we recommend this program to anyone who wants to get an MA. Please get in touch with us. And thank you everybody for participating and for contributing. And thank you, Professor Shearmur, for allowing us to take your time and to learn from you today and to engage with us.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
We end it here. Thank you.